really, I'm kind of happy because this image that we're going to work on right now, this is as fresh as it gets. You can't pretty much get any fresher. This was taken earlier today. I live just about 2 blocks away from this scene here. This is the Boston Marathon, the 2011 Boston Marathon that should be concluding pretty soon now. This was earlier on. This is, I think, the first window of the elite runners, and I actually thought about this. This morning when I was standing here, and I knew I had a long exposure webinar to do, so I'm like, wow, it could be kind of cool to do something very, very fresh. A lot of the images I work on are, a couple of days or a couple of weeks or a couple of months old. This is just a couple of hours, and I literally I played around with this about 10 minutes before the webinar started, so I think it could work pretty well. I'm pretty happy with what I saw, but this will very much be a work in progress. So what do I mean by long exposure? Well, typically when I think of long exposure, I'm thinking about dragging your shutter or letting your shutter stay open for a long amount of time to capture motion. There are various reasons why you would want to use long exposure, and depending on the time of day and the amount of light you have, you can either have long exposure just with the camera and lens, or you might need to introduce a filter to kind of help the camera drag the shutter. So by filters, I'm referring to neutral density filters typically. Sometimes a polarizing filter will do it. But if you think about it, when you're looking through your lens, so pretend your lens is your eye. And so you're looking through your lens and the lens is adapting to the light. Now, if it's too bright when you're outside, what do you typically do? Well, you typically put sunglasses on. At least I do. If it's very bright, I put sunglasses on. Now, the human eye and the brain is a marvel. That's an understatement. So even though I may put a filter or a piece of glass, a darkened piece of glass over my eyes, that does not slow down my brain's ability to process motion. However, it's kind of different with a camera and a lens. A neutral density filter, if you think about it, is think about it as a dense or a thick piece of glass that you can, depending on the density of your filter, sometimes you can kind of see through them, but the filter I use today is a 10-stop neutral density filter. You can't see through it. You'd have to put it up to the sun, and you'd barely make out the sun. So what happens is when you block light from entering the lens using this filter, it takes longer for the camera to expose for the scene. So a scene that would normally maybe take a fraction of a second will take longer depending on your aperture and your ISO. So if you look right here, this shot right here was taken, it took 0.8 seconds. You can see it on the EXIF on the top right here. Now, I thought about it and I'm like, all right, what if we blended this with another exposure like this one? Same exact scene. And to answer the question, to answer Andrew's question, the camera was on a tripod. That was important because I wanted to maintain the exact same perspective. But this one, so we went from 0.8 seconds to 1/1250th of a second. That's, if you do the calculation, the order of magnitude, that's a significant decrease in shutter speed. This is what the camera normally needs when you don't have anything blocking it. So I thought, well, this would be kind of a cool example. This is not so much, part of this webinar is to teach you about long exposure, or at least what I've learned about long exposure. But another part of it is to give you ideas of how you can play around with long exposure. So what are we going to do here? Well, what I thought when I was standing here at the marathon was, let me take 2 exposures, one ghosting the runners and one freezing them in action. And let's send them into Photoshop here. Or you know what? Dare I? Let's do this. Let's go here and let's actually go to perfect layers. And let's see if we can use perfect layers here. So for those of you that are not familiar with perfect layers, it's probably fair because we haven't released it yet. But I figure it'd be a fun time to show it to you guys. Now, Perfect Layers is our Lightroom kind of or aperture layer workflow solution. So if you're in the Lightroom and you want to take two images and blend them together, up until now you'd have to go into Photoshop. But with Perfect Layers, we built our own layers workflow. So you can see we can rename this layer. We'll call this static motion. Actually, static motion is almost an oxymoron, right? So let's just call it static. And then this one, if we hide the upper layer, we'll call this one motion. Okay. So let's turn this layer on here. And what I want to do is I'm actually going to move the motion layer above the static layer. And what we're going to do is we're going to start masking in the people who are in motion. And the way I like to do it is I'm going to drop the opacity of that layer. So as I drop the opacity, you can see that we're starting to see those figures come. And this is good because it's just a reference point. I can see these people are in motion. And so what I can do now is I can take my masking brush. I'm going to drop the opacity of the brush so that we're not, painting in fully. We're not busting through the layer. And now I'm going to select with paint out. I'm going to start to just draw. And because the opacity is at 40%, it's giving me kind of some forgiveness. So I can actually paint in iterations. Each time I paint on top of a certain area, it adds more of the layer below it, or reciprocally, it removes the foreground layer. So here you can see that I'm bringing in some of the detail of the runner, and I'm just choosing what parts. The skin is especially important for me to keep pretty much fully exposed, as it were. But you can see how we're kind of exposing some of that street under him. So what we can do is change from paint out to paint in. I can drop the brush size and just kind of restore some of that over here. And so I'm not going to spend too much time, but I want to show you. So here's that, and then maybe paint this guy. I like this guy. Get him going a little bit. And again, definitely sloppy work. Get this guy. What I'm looking for are people who have good expressions on their faces, who have good motion. But it's nice because what you're doing is you're combining ghosts with people who are solid, and that's what I'm trying to get at. And you can see if we bring the opacity back up, you're getting a better view now. So here you get a better view if you want to paint in the areas around the person. Let's bring up our feathering so we have more of a transition. And just kind of paint in some of that area here so that it's a little bit cleaner. And when I'm going to actually play around with this image more later on in my own time. But for the purposes here, I'm just kind of cleaning this up for us. Because what I can do is, let's just pretend this is an amazingly nice mask. But I'm going to hit File, Save. And then if I go back to Lightroom, let me see here if we implemented that feature yet. Oh, there we go. It had to save first. I'm looking. Oh, there we go. There it is. So there, when you save, you have this layered PSD file. Now here's the cool thing. Watch. If we go to File, or actually let's just right-click on the image and we'll go to Edit in Photoshop. We'll edit the original for the purposes here. But check it out. Photoshop fully recognizes perfect layers files. You can see the two layers we created, motion and static. Here's the layer mask that we created, so we can continue to refine. But the cool thing as well is we can go to, let me just reset our palette here. We can go to PhotoTools now and have some fun. So here this is at this point now this is totally subjective, and this is the first time I'm working in PhotoTools with this image. You know, there are a few things we can do. The first thing in this case, what I might do is I'll go to Image Optimize and go to Daily Multivitamin. What that does is it just kind of boosts contrast and saturation a bit. And then what else can we do? I might just do an overall a basic brush and brush lighter. And what this will allow me to do is kind of brighten up some of the key areas to make them pop. Maybe some of the ghosts. And again, we're being a little sloppy here. What I'll also do is brush darker and darken some of the background, because to me this is distracting. And what I also will do afterwards is I might, in Lightroom, desaturate these people's jackets, because I don't want to crop it tighter. I could probably, but then I'll be losing all this information. So we can do this. Actually, the last thing I'll do is let's go to Image Optimize and let's see what a very tiny amount of local contrast boost will do here. Local contrast boost gives you texture. That's not good. No one ever wants to see this kind of a thing. So I wonder what happened there. Let's remove this effect. Let's try adding it again and see if we get that same result. There we go. That's better. That was a weird situation. But what I'm going to do is drop it down to 0 and just put in a tiny amount, like 8%, because that'll bring out some definition in the motion here. And I don't think that this image really works. We could try perfect layers, like if we hit apply, let PhotoTools render itself. We could go into FocalPoint rather and see if changing our depth of field will help things out. So let's go into FocalPoint and see. Let's edit, let's reset everything. Let's change this to planar shape. And what I'm doing is I'm just adjusting our focus bug so that it's kind of in the foreground here. That's my plane of focus. I want my plane of focus to be the foreground. Now I'm going to drop the amount of blur. The amount of blur, you don't need a lot, just a little bit. Something like this. And then what we could do is, you see this pen here? This pen is a focus brush. And what it'll allow me to do is actually paint focus like on this, the runner here. So if let's say this was someone we knew, what I'll do is I'll usually just brush around the runner first, just get a rough selection, because it's hard to see the outline of what you're brushing in initially, because there's so much out of focus. But once you get a good selection, what you can do is change your mode under the focus brush palette from paint focus to paint blur. And I typically recommend a very, very low opacity of your blur brush, because just a little bit does a really good job of bringing the edges to a blur without it looking artificial. So I think you can see where I'm going here in terms of using FocalPoint. Now we lost these two runners, but that's fine, because we brought them into focus back in perfect layers. These actually they have nice definition to them, these runners in the background. So that's kind of cool. All right. So now I'm going to cancel out of here and we can work on another image. But before I do, let me address some questions that I see. Actually, I won't say, I'll cancel this. Did I use a promote control to capture these two images? No, Joni. What I did was, in this first image, let me go to Lightroom, it'll be easier to see. Let's go to the grid. With this image, for both images, I also have, in addition to a promote control, I have just the standard Canon shutter release cable. So I got my exposure. I figured out that at this aperture, 0.8 seconds is enough. So I just used the shutter release. And then for this exposure, I just used the shutter release too. All I did was I slid the neutral density filter out of its holder so that it wasn't blocking the lens. So I see a lot of people are wondering when perfect layers will be available. I was expecting that. We're going to be releasing our public preview release extremely, extremely soon, like very, very soon. I can't give you a specific date, but I promise you, you won't have to wait very long. It'll be free for everyone to use, and and it'll be great. And we've actually got some pretty fun stuff planned for it. I did use a tripod for this image. It was important that if you go here, if we go to the grid here and select these two images and compare them, you'll see that they are exactly the same positioning. The camera didn't move. And what this allowed me to do was it gave me confidence that when I got this shot over here on the right, I would be able to mask in specific areas without worrying about aligning the two layers. So there's a color shift. Wayne brings up a good point. There is a color shift. There is a color shift because I didn't white balance yet. So I told you how I was kind of rushing. I shot my color checker passport, which I use for white balance. So I didn't do a custom white balance yet. That's a Wayne. If I had a gold star to give you, I'd give it to you because you're 100% right. What I'd want to do first is do a color correction here. So the white balance is off here. The white balance is a little bit off here. But if you have something like a color checker passport, it does a good job of giving you a baseline to create a custom white balance. All right, let me just see. The version of Perfect Layers that we're going to be releasing very, very soon is we call it a public preview release. It's more finalized than the beta, but we still are looking for everyone's feedback, so we're going to give it away for free for everyone to use until the final version. Okay, well, let me move on to the next image. Jacqueline, would I have removed the wires? Jacqueline's wondering if I would remove these wires up here. I was looking at that, and part of me, I wouldn't bother for several reasons. First, there are a lot of wires. Two, if I remove the wires, I'd probably have to remove the wire poles, and that there are a lot of wire poles. But three, this is a residential community. This is where the town that I live in, Framingham, Massachusetts, and it just kind of adds to the authenticity of the scene. I would be more apt to remove wires if this was kind of a landscape scene and there was just a random high tension wire going through the scene. But in this case here, I could crop down from this side, so I could probably go to this image, and we could have, and I might actually do this. I might crop it down to make it more pronounced, like that. I would probably do this actually. So you do minimize the lines. Again, I haven't even had more than a breath to work on this image, but I'm looking forward to getting it going. All right, let's go to this next image here. So this image is an infrared long exposure HDR. I took this on Martha's Vineyard a couple of weeks ago when I went to visit. Now, you see kind of this, I don't know if you guys can see this, but in the middle of the frame there is this weird kind of light area. Now, no, it's not Mars, Andrew. That's why I love infrared, is because it gives this weird tint to the image. I have a Canon 40D that converted to infrared. I had my 70 to 200 millimeter lens mounted with the B+W 10 stop neutral density filter, and I just kind of let it go. It took 30 seconds at f/29 with an ISO of 100. So let's actually go and let's work on this image in Photoshop. So this was just a stand. There's nothing in terms of there's nothing special here that I've done so far. I'll close this image out. All I did was I just kind of did that long exposure. First thing I usually do, guys, in my workflow is I'll use a healing brush and I'll get rid of noise. I don't know if you guys can even see the noise through the compression over the internet, but it's the first thing I always do. The next thing I would do is I would add noise reduction to the sky, but the sky looks pretty good. It's pretty smooth, so I don't need to do much here. I'll combat this area in the middle later on. So this is an image I actually posted on my blog a couple of weeks ago. And the first thing I did was I converted it to black and white. So if you go into PhotoTools, we have some pretty cool black and white filters. Under the black and white treatments category, it's really a matter of kind of playing around and finding one that you like. I think I did an IR, and let's start with light. So light's a bit too light. What I can do is, you see this little icon here that has a contrast? Any effect that has multiple options under the details palette will also have this little icon here. What that means is if you double click it, this little hot pop-up comes up. It's the same options that you'll have here, except if you wanted to change it here, you'd have to remove the effect and then change the option and add it to the stack. Here, we can change it on the fly. So I'm not really liking this effect here. And this is kind of trial and error. We'll remove it and we'll try something else. We can try a regular filter and then see what maybe the red filter looks like. And then try the blue. All right, so I'm kind of liking this, what this is looking like. We're getting a little bit more contrast in the scene. And I'm going to do one more effect. I'm thinking I'm going to do the Mac G cool. All right, that's what I'm looking for, some drama. So I'm going to drop it back and bring it up to a place where I'm happy. I'm going to bring it actually to 100%, and I'm going to mask out using my masking brush. I'm going to mask out at a low opacity in the foreground because it's a bit too dark for me. So that's, you know what, I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to bring the opacity up a little bit. Or actually, no, I'm going to bring it down even more. I want a very, very light removal. Okay, that's a little bit better. Now what we can do is let's add a little bit of that tonal contrast again. We'll go into the image optimize and then go to the local contrast boost. And let's add it to the stack. And again, local contrast boost, you never want to use too much of it. Now to combat this area here, what we can do is go to the basic brush. And there was a good, I just saw a good question here. Not a question, but by Jim saying that he's been reading that when you use like for instance an infrared camera or any camera with a very small aperture like f/29, or in this case I said it was at f/32, it can soften the image because of the light bounce, and so I do agree with that. Every lens that you use has a kind of a sweet spot in terms of its aperture, and it's funny because you buy a lens and you're like, oh, if I'm gonna, my 70-200 can close down to f/32, which is a tiny aperture. I must be able to get the sharpest images with that. It's actually not necessarily the case, and I agree with you, Jim. I've actually read the same thing. Typically, what you'll want to do is you can either figure it out for yourself or research, but you can find out what that sweet spot aperture is for your lens. Typically, I find that the sweet spot for most lenses, the aperture is between f/11 and f/16. So a lot of times now, I don't really deviate outside of that, unless I really need to. Usually I'll deviate from that when I'm using a 10-stop filter. When I want to, the more you close down your aperture, the smaller your aperture, the longer your shutter speed will take with the filter in front of it. And so if I really want to maximize the motion here, I'm going to drop my aperture to its smallest amount. So that's a good comment to bring up. But like I was saying, to kind of combat this area, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my basic brushes and add this first one, this brush darker. And I'm going to adjust my feathering, and I'm going to start drawing in over here in this area here. I'm going to show my mask to make sure I've got that area there, which I do. And now I can increase the strength. Just kind of mask it in. Oh, I see what happened. I see what happened. Let me delete this. I know what I did. My opacity of my brush was way low. So let me add that again. So I was like, that should be a lot darker. So let's just paint it in here. And then let's drop the fade to blend. I'm going to do another one. and just paint it in. Do you see what I mean? You can actually add if the same effect in stacks. You don't have to do it just once. And so I'm just kind of closing this up. And again, I'll add it. And you can do this in Lightroom too, actually, with their adjustment brush. So just kind of keep, what we're doing is we're constantly blending in until you kind of get a good sweet spot or you're happy with what you see. But in this case here, what I'm going to do is I want to compare, because I see some people asking the comparison between doing it in here and in Lightroom. So let's do this. Let's remove these three effects, and we'll do it in Lightroom. So the first thing here, I'm happy with this. I'm pretty happy with all of this. I'm going to hit apply, but I'm not done with it. What I want to do is change my plane of focus. I can show you also in Photoshop, if you guys are interested, how you can kind of add a dodge or burn effect. So I'm going to actually go here and turn on my application frame so that we can hide the background. What I'm going to do is, one of the ways I learned early on to kind of do a dodge or burn, which is to lighten or darken. Take your active layer, go to layer, then go to new layer, and then what we're going to do is we're going to go from normal to overlay. We're going to change our blending mode to overlay. And then the key here is to fill with an overlay neutral color, 50% gray. We'll hit OK. So now we've got this gray layer. I'm going to take my brush here, and you see the foreground background is black and white. Black will be to darken, white will be to brighten. So white is dodge, black is burn. So I'm going to use black, and you really only want to be at about a 10% strength for your brush, and you can kind of just brush that in and blend it in. So you see kind of how that's working out, and what you'll want to do is you also want to make sure that you have the blending. The reason why I don't do this type of effect in Photoshop is because it compounds. You see how you keep drawing and it adds where you overlap, it darkens that area. I don't like that. So I'm going to remove that altogether. We'll do it in Lightroom as a final option. But first, let's go to FocalPoint here. Now, the reason why I used a long exposure on this image was because the original shot was very boring. There wasn't much to it. Adding the motion of the water really added kind of that otherworldly feel to it. Like these are actually like people standing there. And we'll be able to pronounce that now with FocalPoint. So again, here we've got FocalPoint. You can adjust the size and the shape of your focus bug, but I'm going to change the from round to planar, the overall shape, and I'm going to make it so that the point of focus is just on these little pieces of wood. I'm also going to change the plane of focus. So to change the plane of focus, your cursor has to be inside the focus bug. And then you'll want to hold the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on a PC and drag up. So you see how the plane of focus is changing? Now we're starting to get a little bit of that kind of tilt shift effect. I'm going to adjust the size here, and I'm going to adjust the amount. I'm going to drop it down. I don't really need that much blur. Also increase the feathering to have more of a kind of a smoother transition. So now we're starting to get a really cool effect here. We can also decrease the brightness of the areas that are out of focus and boost the contrast to really draw your eye to the center of the frame. Also adjust the positioning of it. So now I'll hit apply. And then I'll save this image so that we can go back into Lightroom to finish working on it. All right, so here's our image. Here's our original, and here's what we've done so far. Now the last thing I want to do is just use an adjustment brush in Lightroom to kind of see if we can darken this. And this is my favorite method of doing it. We've showed you how to do it in PhotoTools and in Photoshop. With the Develop module, you've got this icon right here on the top right. It's your adjustment brush. You can also hit K on your keyboard to bring it up. The effect I'm going to use is brightness, and I'm going to drop it really low. And I'm doing this on purpose. So I'm just going to kind of paint over here. Now, the reason why I did it really low is because I want to see where it's being applied. But now all I need to do is if I put my cursor over the numbers on the right, you see how you get this little hand with an arrow pointing left and right? It turns into basically a scrubby brush. So what a scrubby brusher allows you to do is scrub to the right and to the left. And so you can kind of see where your effect is applied. You can also keep compounding on it like we did before. We can just kind of brush over here and adjust the brightness. And this is what you have to do. This is unfortunately from what I was told was, and this is my own fault. A lot of times when you're shooting here with a long exposure, and if you're using live view, what you'll want to do is Nikon cameras, depending on the Nikon model, has this feature built in, but you'll want to make sure that you cover your eyepiece because you'll get depending on it usually affects longer exposures, but you'll get this light leak from the optical viewfinder, and if you don't cover it, you'll get these kind of defects, which is a kind of a huge bummer. And I just forgot to bring my eyepiece cover. Some of the Nikons are Nikon cameras, like the D700 has a little switch, which I don't understand why Canon can't bring it into their cameras, but it's so beautiful because all you do is flip the switch up and a curtain drops down, blocking the optical viewfinder. And this is something you'll really want to do. It's a good point to bring up with long exposure photography. If you're doing a long exposure, especially during the day, make sure you cover that eyepiece. A lot of times with Canons, they'll include a little rubbery cover, so you have to pop off the rubber diopter that you have, or the rubber eyepiece cover over your diopter. You pop that off and you put on the cover. It's not the most convenient thing in the world, but that's the way it is. So here we've done a pretty good job of minimizing that middle part and blending in the rest of it. We also brought out some more of that shadow area, which is nice. But it's I kind of like that. And you can see if we go here to the develop module, this is our before. So I don't know if you guys know this, but in Lightroom, if you hit the backslash key, which is above your enter key, you see up here, you see this before, it'll show you the image before you made any changes, and then after. So it does actually, I'm happy with my blending using the adjustment brush. Is this just with cameras? Andrew, great question. So Andrew's wondering whether this blocking the optical viewfinder is only something you would do when you're using live view. No, it's whenever you're doing a long exposure, live view or not. The bottom line is if your optical viewfinder is exposed, meaning your face is not against it, which is typically the case for long exposure, you'll want to make sure something is covering it, because light will leak through. If you think about it, even though the shutter is typically pretty airtight or light tight, when you're doing a long exposure, the shutter pops up, exposing the sensor. Now, usually the mirror is popped up so you can't see anything through the optical viewfinder, but if it's bright enough light, it'll seep through in the smallest amounts, and it'll build up over time. So if you're doing a 2 or 3 minute exposure, you might get some defects like that. So, so Ron's saying that the Canon's got the viewfinder curtain on their Pro cameras, so I assume it's on the the 1D Mark IV or the 1DS Mark III. That's a shame because the 5D Mark II is a professional grade camera as well. And I know that the D700 has it with Nikon. I don't know if the D300. D3, yeah, I would imagine D3 has it as well. That's a bad boy camera. And D3 does not. The D300 does not. Okay, so yeah, Steve's kind of Steve. I agree with you. It's not a light leak, but it is light bouncing off the mirrors. I just was calling it a light leak because technically the light is kind of hitting the sensor from the optical viewfinder. But you're absolutely right. Typically, a leak is coming through the front as well, or it's a bleed around the sensor. So these are things that you'll want to kind of consider. And yeah, Steve, I do totally agree with you there with the actual verbiage used. All right, let's work on another image. Might as well. We're having fun, right? Let's see. We can do this HDR image here. Um, so I also use HDR for my long exposure to kind of bring out um, tonal range in, even though it's a long exposure, you can see that. So I took this on January 1st of this year. January 1st is probably one of the best times to go shooting in a major urban area, at least in Boston, because it is dead. I don't know if people are nursing their hangovers or what, but it is last year and this year. I've had the best time shooting because you have the city to yourself. And part of why I use a long exposure here was to kind of give you that feeling. So this is Storrow Drive in Boston. And normally there are cars on here pretty much all day, all night. It's one of the major arteries in Boston, and that right there in the background is the Back Bay area of Boston. That's the Hancock Tower and the Prudential Center, and this is I think a Boston University dorm building. And the problem is that John caught the EXIF. So this image here took 197 seconds. So that's, you're just kind of, with long exposure photography, it's a practice in patience. But this was my shadow bracket. So I wanted to expose for the darker parts of the image. Now you can see as we start cycling through, this is a 10-second exposure, and this is just getting the details of the sky. And we just, what I'm doing is here, this is a 20-second, a 45-second, a 75-second, and then we had that 190-second. So I was just basically compounding. Now I already have the HDR image here. So this is the high end, and this is our HDR image. So you can see we now have kind of a good representative image. We have a good blending. Was it early morning? No, Arita. This was midday. This was actually, this was 3:11 p.m. Eastern time when I took this image. And that's one of the nice things about neutral density filters is that that's one of the best parts. It really is, that you can go out in the middle of the day in the brightest light and still get good photography because you're kind of combating the sun. One of the nice byproducts, and we can do this in another image, is you actually can kind of remove or ghost out tourists. And I kind of went to that rationale with the marathon shot from this morning that we went over. So here we've got this nice shot, and again, there were cars driving through here. Don't think that there were no automobiles. They were going up and down, but because the exposures were so long, they kind of get ghosted out. If the cars were really bright, typically you'd see that, but the darker cars, they don't even register. So here, let's go into Photoshop, and let's just work on this image really quickly. Again, we can go into PhotoTools, and just to give you guys some ideas of what we can do. Right off the bat, I'm going to apply Cyberpunk to the roads. I know that much. I love Cyberpunk with roads. And that's the thing about PhotoTools. You apply your effect, you get it to the strength you want, paying attention to only the element that you care about, invert the mask, which hides the effect. It doesn't get rid of it, it just hides it. And then with the masking brush, if you select your mode from paint out to paint in, you kind of paint in that cyberpunk effect where you want it. And you kind of want to be careful if you're working on this for production, meaning this is like your real shot. When you're drawing, you don't want the cyberpunk to go into the median because the median has leaves on it. And the leaves don't look good with that cool tone, at least in my opinion. I'm going to actually add a specific tone for the leaves right down the middle to separate them. All right, next I'm going to apply a golden hour enhancer to warm up the sky. Actually, I might keep it for the whole image. I kind of like that. Next, I'm going to apply pastel colors, and the pastel colors is a great effect for foliage. Keep that in mind. You see how it kind of brightens the foliage up? So let's drop it down and boost it just a bit. Actually, I'm going to boost it a lot. I'm going to invert it and just paint it down the middle. And what this will do is it'll act as a nice visual separator between the two sides of the road. And then finally, I'll add an effect called just enough darkness to pop the shadows, the contrast in the shadows. But we don't need this much. Let's drop it down. There, that's good. So here, if you hit none, what it'll do is PhotoTools will hide that bar. And then if you hit Command 0, you can see a nice larger screen or a nice preview. So here's our original, kind of flat, but still a good tone mapped image. And here's our final image. Now let's actually hit apply because we're going to go into FocalPoint again. I think this image works well with FocalPoint. So we'll go into FocalPoint, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my plane of focus. We'll just keep the same settings because it's the same tilt, and I'm just going to put it over here to bring up the feathering so that we have a nice smooth transition. And then I'm going to paint focus on the skyline. Make sure that it's nice and sharp. And it actually already is. But also what I want to do is paint focus on the top of this building. Let me bring my focus brush, the opacity to 100%. So think about it, and this is important if you're going to play around with FocalPoint like this. Your plane of focus, if we show the mask, this is your plane of focus. Everything that's in black. Now, this building, this tall dorm building, is on our plane of focus. So the plane of focus going vertically should be the same as what's on street level, which is why you want to make sure that you mask in the edges of this building. And then with a really small brush, let's just paint in that bar. Let's see what we have with our brightness contrast. If we drop it down a bit and boost the contrast, and maybe add a little bit of a vignette to kind of burn the edges. That's looking pretty cool right there. So here we can actually, I kind of am bothered. I painted out a little bit of the sky, so there's a weird effect. I don't know if you guys can catch it. So again, I'm going to paint the blur, but very, very low opacity. Anything 15% and under should be okay. No, you see, that's too much. So you see, what you want to do is maybe even like 5%. You want the blur to match the rest of the blur. So here I totally ruined it, which is a bummer. I added, let me see if I bring it up a bit. I wonder what's going on if there's too much blur. Oh, I see what happened. So be it. These are the things that happen. You kind of try to fix it or make it better, and you end up making it worse. Okay, let me close this out, and then let's try one more image. That could be a good lesson. This could be a good one. I did this, I worked on this one on our first iteration of this series. So I'm going to take this image. This was just taken with, this actually was the same shot over here, except I think it was actually this one right here, or one of these. I was basically standing right over it. And I had my Lee Big Stopper ND filter, and what it did was it kind of created almost like a glass reflective surface out of the water. Even though waves constantly came through, it just looks like perfectly serene water. And that's why I love these 10-stop filters. So what I can do is let's send this into Photoshop, and I'm going to show you what you can do to really, really protect this part of the image while blurring out the rest using FocalPoint. So FocalPoint has the ability to protect certain parts of your scene. I don't know if you know this or not. Meaning, I know that whatever happens in FocalPoint, I want this piece of wood to be in focus. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to make a selection around it. So the easiest way that I like to make selections is just using the quick select brush in Photoshop. And so I'm just basically drawing, and the nice thing about the Photoshop quick select brush is it has a pretty good algorithm to detect edges. It's not the best, but it's okay. It's enough to kind of get you started. So here I'm just going to kind of refine my edge. And I'm not too worried about the bottom, and I'll show you why in a second. But I'm just trying to get it as close as possible around the subject. And what I do a lot of times is I'll just, with my eyes, scan around the edge. So I'll see like right here, oops, I forgot that. Kind of get those a little bit, and then the edges here. And then just kind of, let's get that, and bring this out a bit. Oops. And then just bring that in there. Okay, now I'm going to invert the selection. Now, why do I want to invert the selection? Well, if I send, I had said how if you bring something into FocalPoint that has a selection, FocalPoint will only work on the selection. So because the wood is selected, if I bring it into FocalPoint, it'll blur the wood, but it won't touch anything else. And I want the complete opposite. What I want is the wood to be in focus, but everything else blurred. So by selecting the inverse, by going to select and then inverse, it selects everything but the wood. And now if I go into FocalPoint, you can see how the wood is, no matter what, the wood's is protected. Now I'm going to put my plane of focus at the bottom here. You remember how I said in the previous image that that dorm building was on the same plane of focus as the ground? Well, so my plane of focus is right here. This piece of wood is on my plane of focus. So the whole entire piece of wood has to be in focus. If the wood was lying down on the surface, meaning this was chopped down and it was on the ground, that's a different story. But this is it's a linear path on your plane of focus. So what we can do is we can kind of bring up the amount of blur to really exaggerate a shallow depth of field. And then we can really darken that area and boost the contrast. And so that's a way to kind of simulate a shallow depth of field, but retain this plane of focus. Might actually make it more of a vignette. And so here's our original. And then this is what we were able to do with FocalPoint, because we made that selection and then inverted it. So if there's anything ever in a scene that you want to protect, make a selection around it first. And so this worked out really nicely. You have a very, very nice three-dimensional quality to this shot that you can just hit apply and let it render. Now here's another quick trick that I want to show you in Photoshop. So let's say you know that you want to come back. Maybe you're not happy with this blur, or maybe this is for a client. They're going to want the blur to be a little bit brighter. So if you came back later and you wanted to kind of work on this exact same image, your selection would be lost. You'd have to make that quick selection and then invert it. If you go to the channels palette, and you can get to that in Photoshop by going to Window and then selecting Channels. If you click on this little icon that looks like a layer mask, you can save that selection as an alpha channel. So what will happen is you come back in a week from now or 2 weeks from now, and you save this as a layered PSD file, so you've got your layers. If you want to load that selection and you save the alpha channel, you were smart enough to save the alpha channel, just hit Command or Control in the thumbnail, and you see how it loads that selection. So it saves you time. And now you can go back into FocalPoint and readjust it, which is cool. All right, let me see if there are any questions. Is that dirty sensor spot on top left? Yeah, likely, David. In the previous image, I think it was. I haven't cleaned my sensor in too long, and it's my own fault. Yeah, Brad's bringing out that I didn't get the asphalt on this previous image to the right, just because I wasn't really spending too much time on it. This roadway. Does focal point darken the image? Um, it darkens the image only if you would use the brightness and contrast settings in focal point. So if you go here again, and I didn't make my selection. So this is what would happen. This is basically what you would see if you didn't make your selection around the wood. The wood would be rendered out of focus, and then you'd need to use a focus brush to bring it in, and it would take forever. But this is what focal point will darken and brighten if you use these brightness and contrast sliders. But otherwise, it does not darken the image at all. How does the perspective blur get changed on the Mac? Here, Ali. So what you do is, I'm going to bring the focus brush. Let's reset everything, actually, so you can see. So here you've got your circular focus bug. I'm going to change the lens from, or not the lens, rather, the shape from round to planar. So now we've got this planar bug. I'm going to make it horizontal. To change the plane of focus, your cursor has to be in the body of the bug. So the body of the bug is the square. And then you want to press and hold on a Mac with using the Option key. On a PC, it'd be the Alt key. And then drag up or down. So as I'm dragging up, you see the plane of focus changing. And as I drag down, it changes the opposite direction. So that's how you create kind of you change the perspective of your blur. And you're saying, I noticed that you did not edit any of these photos in Photoshop. Is this your normal workflow? Typically, yeah. My normal workflow is I import the images into Lightroom. I go through my rating process to see which images I want to work on. The images I want to work on, if it's an HDR image, I'll tone map it. I use two different products for tone mapping. I use HDR Express by Unified Color, and I use Photomatics by HDR Soft. Once the image is tone mapped, I'll go straight into PhotoTools and FocalPoint. Those are pretty much the first two products I'll use. Actually, I scratched that. Before that, I'll do dust removal on the HDR image. I'll do noise reduction if it needs it. Then I'll do stylization, like I've been showing you here, PhotoTools, FocalPoint, sometimes PhotoFrame. And then finally, like if we cancel out of here, one thing I might do is I might add an adjustment layer for levels, so I'll bring up the white point to where I start to see an incline, and then I'll also drop the black point just a bit, and then I'll adjust the overall midpoint, the midpoint, so you can see that it's a slight difference, but it does a nice job of kind of cleaning up the image. I might also so here, let's say we save this. Something I might do is I'll go back into Lightroom. So yeah, here we go. I'll go here. I'll go into the develop module, and then I have a brush that I created, and it's an HDR texture boost is what I call it. Basically, it's an increase in brightness, an increase in contrast, and a boost in clarity and sharpness. And I'll just paint it on things that have texture. And what it does is it brings out the texture of whatever you draw on. But you want to be careful not to over sharpen. So Andrew, there are plenty of resources if you're new to Lightroom. I would recommend going to the NAPP, the National Association of Photoshop Professionals. They've got a ridiculous amount of Lightroom content training. Yeah, it really did make it pop out. Or the texture brush is I use it pretty often. So, do I shoot at night or low light as well? I do, absolutely. I will. At night or at low light, you don't really need a neutral density filter because it's so dark as it is. What you do want is you want to have something that has a lot of light movement. So your typical scenes will be traffic, light trails, like star trails, to capture the motion there. Um, you can also a common long exposure use for at night is if you have some sort of a cityscape or a village that is perched with water in the foreground, and you get the nice reflection in the foreground, and it's kind of a symmetrical reflection. The longer you keep your exposure, the more you'll get that kind of very cool symmetry. Marsha, great question. Marsha's asking us, so what kind of neutral density filters do I recommend? So we can close it up with that, actually. I'll show you the two that I currently own. Um, the first one, so I bought my leaf filter. I'm going to plug them because they're a small local company in New Hampshire. The company is 2filter.com. I'll put it in the chat module now. Actually, I'll put the link directly to that filter. Um, it's the Big Stopper by Lee. So Leaf Filters, and so the Big Stopper is sold out, and it's sold out, but they keep getting. It took me about 2 days to get the Big Stopper. I think. Let me go here to this page, or if you want to read about it, I'll just give you this link. We'll put it here. So that's the first 10-stop neutral density filter I have. Be warned though, if you buy it, you need to buy two other things. You need to buy the foundation kit, which is this. You see this outer ring? The Lee Big Stopper is just a piece of glass. It's a 4x4 piece of glass. But then you need this foundation kit to hold it, so you slide it down, and then you need an adapter ring for the foundation kit to mount on. So this is the foundation kit, 76.66 US, and then you'll get. I have a 77mm adapter ring, which is 27.74 US. So 133 plus 30 plus 80, just rounding up, is what that costs. Now the other filter I have, if you go to Beach Photo Video for B&H, which I think is closed. Yeah, it's closed for I think the Jewish holiday of Passover through next week. You can go to what I have is called the B plus W 3.0 ND 77mm thread, and I'll put that link directly to it. Yeah, this is it, and this is 125.50 US. So it's not cheap, but it's a lot of fun. So I've got both of these, and I love them. Is it like the Koken? Yeah, it's kind of like, would the Koken holder work? It should. If the Koken holder holds 4-inch filters, because that's just a 4x4-inch filter, um, it should work. I just prefer, if I'm buying a leaf filter, I'll just have that. Do I ever use Apple Aperture, Marcos? I only use Apple Aperture when I have to do a video tutorial for On1, but otherwise I never use it. Not for any reason other than I'm just a Lightroom guy. Do you meter outside of the camera? Great question. Great question. So the question is, do I meter outside of the camera? This is a good point if any of you are going to invest in 10-stop neutral density filters. If you put that filter in front of your camera lens and you look through the optical viewfinder, you will see zero. You will see black. I use live view. So if your camera has live view, which most cameras do these days, if with live view, because you're actually letting light pour through the filter onto the sensor, you can see pretty well through it. Now, if it's dark, like even like around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, you're kind of cutting it. It's going to get very hard to see. But in the middle of the day, you can see just fine. And so I meter through that because it's pretty accurate. Otherwise, you could. I have a spot meter. I've got a Sekonic 758 DR spot meter. I don't usually use it. A lot of times, truthfully, guys and girls, a lot of times I'll just eyeball it. I'll try, because my camera can only meter up until 30 seconds to get to the mid-range. If it's longer than 30 seconds, I don't know. So I'll try 45 seconds, and if it's too dark, I'll try 60. Well, and a lot of people, unless you have a spot meter, even that, it's kind of hard because you have to kind of simulate having the filter on. It's just trial and error. That's what it is. And at the very least, by doing 60 seconds, 45 seconds, 90 seconds, I'm creating brackets. So if I wanted a tone map, I could. And yeah, Andrew's saying that the picture of Martha's Vineyard brings back memories. I have to tell you guys, I went to Martha's Vineyard. What was the date? It was just a couple of weeks ago. So let me hide this. 3/26. So yeah, just about 3 weeks ago. Still off season. We had the run of the mill on this island. We had the entire beach to ourselves. We went to the Gay Head Lighthouse, which is on the other end of the island. No one was there. It was perfect. So It was freezing, but it was well worth the trip because for long exposure, you kind of, it's a lot of practice. It's a lot of time. One exposure could take a minute, and when you're thinking about, typically shooting at 1/1000 of a second compared to 60 seconds, it's a lot longer. So one, you have to you become more methodical on what you're going to shoot, because that's 60 seconds you've just wasted. So you think about the shot much more, which I love, which I'm a huge advocate of. And it also really makes you appreciate what you're doing instead of running and gunning. Um, Arita, yes. So Arita's saying that for neutral density filters, they do give you a reference card. Um, with the Big Stopper, you get this card, and it says if your original exposure is, say, 1/250th of a second, the 10 stop exposure will be 3 seconds. So it does come with that. I leave that at home. I I guess that's why, I'm not the smartest person in the world. I prefer to kind of do experimentation. But you do get that, and you can find that actually online very easily too. There are plenty of guides out there.